Again, and I believe we are recording. Hello, thank you. Can I ask you to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your job and experience there.
I'm Nick Downing. I currently am a shift manager at the Davis-Besse Nuclear Power Station, but prior to that, I spent 9 years in the Navy. I served on the Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier in the reactor department. Then I transferred to New York to a training command where we trained the new sailors how to operate nuclear power plants. So there are 2 operating nuclear power plants in upstate New York that we do hands-on training. This background in nuclear power transitioned well for me into the civilian nuclear power world. I got my senior reactor operator license in 2011. It's an 18-month training course, and at the end, there's a 2-week-long exam. It's a written and simulator-based exam. Basically, it gives you a driver's license to operate a nuclear power plant. So
Cool.
I've been on shift since 2011. As I said, I'm currently one of the 5 shift managers. So we have 5 operating crews. I'm one of the shift managers of an operating crew. So I have about 15 people that work for me that maintain and run day-to-day operations of the plant. My primary job is to ensure safety of the plant is maintained at all times. I'm trained to combat any type of equipment malfunction or plant event that might occur. My overall responsibility is to protect the health and safety of the public.
Thank you. That's excellent. I'm glad we have people in those roles that can be looking out for us and keep these things safe, especially in light of what we've been looking at in this past week or so, trying to give perspective. And I know I gave you these questions ahead of time, so I mentioned this, but we were looking at those 5 different big reactors. Basically, I was looking at the INES, International Nuclear and Radioactive Event Scale, I think,
Right.
and looking at the 5, 6, and 7s that were there as far as the seriousness of the incidents. And of just the major events, like I'm like definitely Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, stuff like that. Is there one that you wish people understood better, or you feel like people had a major misunderstanding about?
Not one specific that I wish people understood better, but I would like to clarify some differences between some of those events. So the Chernobyl event occurred because they disabled safety systems and ran a test that was against the recommendations of the engineers at the station. So they basically turned off safety systems and did something they shouldn't do, and it resulted in a huge disaster. And one important thing to note there is that they had no containment structure around the reactor. They just had a building with concrete slabs above the reactor. That is not the case in the United States. And then Fukushima, their big downfall was, I think, in my opinion, was their design basis. So what happens when you design a nuclear power plant is they come up with all the credible design basis events. There's a lot of them. And then through analytical calculation and system design, they make sure that they can combat any one of those design basis events. They make a lot of assumptions. Typically, for instance, at our plant, we assume a maximum earthquake, maximum Richter scale earthquake that has ever occurred in the state of Ohio. And then we add some amount of margin to that, and then we design the plant for that. The max possible or the max probable plus that margin. What they did is they took the max probable, and then they didn't really add any margin. That plant was also supposed to be down the coast, several miles, and it would have resulted in that plant being way up on a cliff. But the cost to pump the water from the ocean up the cliff into the plant was so high that they decided to build it in a different location instead. Well, that made it very susceptible to the real problem that occurred, which was the tsunami. And then you look at 3 Mile Island. So they have, and that's all regulated by the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They had a good design basis. What they did or failed to do was properly operate the plant when they had a problem. So what happened is they had a relief valve, a pilot operated relief valve that stuck open, and they didn't realize that it was open, and that was what was causing them the problems. So they basically had a hole in their primary coolant system, but they didn't recognize it, and they thought that their indications were not accurate. So they took a bunch of actions that they shouldn't have taken, and even though they had an issue that they didn't properly address and they took incorrect actions, there was not a large-scale release of radioactivity to the public. One of the big reasons why is they had a containment building. It's a stainless steel lined concrete reinforced structure that kept all that bad stuff in. All the plants in the United States have these containment structures, and that's the last line of defense to protect the public, basically. Because of those 3 events that I talked about, we've made some pretty major changes in the nuclear power industry. You got to remember, back when Chernobyl occurred and 3 Mile Island occurred, the nuclear power industry was pretty new. There was a lot we didn't really understand, and the training wasn't as good as it is today. So since those events, we've implemented, because of 3 Mile Island, we now have a shift technical advisor on every shift. They don't have to be licensed, but most of them are. They have to have some sort of engineering background, engineering degree. And the reason they implemented that is because they didn't understand when this relief valve was open, that the downstream piping temperature would not be the same temperature as the reactor coolant system because it was going to a pressurized tank. So I won't get into a lot of detail there, but they didn't understand some basics of thermodynamics.
Right.
So they implemented that position on shift. We've also, after Fukushima, we built a $100 million building on site that is seismic, it's tornado proof, and it is designed for beyond design basis external events. So those events have been described by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to be extreme heat, extreme cold, flooding, either internal or external, extended loss of AC power, and spent fuel pool cooling. So we have all these new systems and structures on site, big pumps, all these books with coping strategies for the day that should never happen. It's all beyond design basis. So we've implemented a ton of extra equipment. All the plants in the United States had to do this. They came up with their own methods and systems for it, but we're all required to do it.
Would you say the name of the game is
redundancy? I guess. Oh yeah, redundancy for sure. And now we have so many redundant systems that when we're in the simulator and doing training, they have to fail so much stuff for us to actually be unable to cool the reactor core. I mean, they have to fail everything.
That's reassuring. That's very reassuring.
There's a lot of redundancy and a lot of good procedures.
Yeah.
All right, go on.
When was your plant built? I don't know that one off the top of my head. Do you know?
It was, I think it went online in 81,
Okay.
82,
Gotcha. Because I know
somewhere around then.
freeze after 3 Mile Island, where they weren't doing any new construction for a long time.
Right. We have the same design plant as 3 Mile Island.
Gotcha.
So I'm pretty familiar with their design because we have the same plant. There's minor differences, but for the most part, it's the same.
Cool. You gave us some amazing, great information looking into some of these previous disasters. The top three that you were talking about, which are definitely the most known, and some of the other ones, is there a separate incident, a separate disaster that you think people should know more about?
I don't think a separate disaster or incident. One interesting fact is because we have the same design plant as 3 Mile Island. We have this same pilot operated relief valve that is susceptible. It's no longer susceptible, but it used to be susceptible to failing open. So what occurred is the valve failed open and they didn't recognize it. Well, that same event happened at our plant like 6 months earlier.
Oh, wow.
But the operators recognized that event and they mitigated it, and it was kind of flew under the radar.
Yeah.
So since then, the nuclear industry has shared information between the plants quite a bit. There are event reports that go out to all plants, and there's a grading scale for all the events. So if the event is a bad event, then there will be some requirement for the other plants to train on that event. So we get training on all the events around the industry pretty regularly. We'll do case studies and train on those events so that we don't fall into the same mindset or traps that they did.
That's great collaboration. Now, is that only within our country or like that NRC regulated, or do they have full international participation in that?
It's international. There's the World Association of Nuclear Operations and then we have our own Institute of Nuclear Power Operations in the United States. So they collaborate with each other. I would say we get less training on international plants. I think mostly because the design is different. But when it is applicable, then we definitely train on those.
I was only wondering because like that one MIAC plant is still operational and they're still having issues. I'm guessing they're not trying to collaborate and look at mistakes that other people are making and learn from them. And then isn't China scaling up at a much more rapid rate? Either they beat us in the last couple of years or they're about to for the number of active nuclear plants. Are we learning from them and they learning from us?
They're definitely building much faster than we are. We have a couple plants that are in construction right now, but not very many. The cost to build a plant is pretty astronomical.
Yeah.
And the government is not really providing much help in the United States. I think the difference in China is that they're building multiple units of the same exact design plant, and the government is behind it. So a single company doesn't have to take a huge risk financially to build a new plant over in China.
Here in Kennett Square, there's a big building 2 or 3 miles that way for the Exelon Corporation. And Exelon was operating the second tower reactor at 3 Mile Island up until last year. But they were operating at a loss. They were saying they weren't making enough money. It was to maintain appropriate safety and regulations and do things there. it was just, it wasn't a venture where they were actually making enough money for it. So some of the government subsidies might help with that, but this is fascinating stuff. Did you have, I'm sorry, I didn't do great with my questions here. Did you have a separate interesting fact about nuclear power? Or was it what you were talking about with your design compared to 3 Mile Island?
I've got something else for you. So
Excellent.
a lot of times we push politically, we're pushing green energy, right? So nuclear energy is what I would consider green energy. There is some debate there, but there's no carbon emissions that come from nuclear power. And what's interesting is that they keep pushing politically, even last night, that we want to transition more to green energy. Well, the majority of the power in the United States is produced from fossil fuels and nuclear. So we have no ability to replace any of that fossil fuel power and nuclear power with green energy. So in the generation industry, the electrical power generation industry, each plant is assigned what's called a capacity factor. And a capacity factor is a ratio of the actual electrical power produced versus the max power possible over the course of a year. So I've got some statistics here for you, and they're not exact, but I think they're pretty close. So nuclear, the capacity factor for nuclear in the United States is about 92%. That means we produce 92% of our maximum capability, maximum power output. Hydroelectric power is about 40%. Wind is about 34%, and solar is about 25%. So what you see here when you look at these percentages is nuclear is not only green, but it's also reliable. We're 92, you could say we're 92% reliable, as opposed to solar that's 25% reliable. I don't know about you, but I want my lights on 100% of the time at my house. So I'm a big proponent of nuclear power, not just because I work in it. So here's another interesting thing. So the largest generating station in the United States is Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State. They have the capability of producing 6,809 megawatts.
Wow.
At any given time. It's huge. It's huge. The largest nuclear facility in the United States is Palo Verde in Arizona, and they have the capability of producing 3,492. So, 3,942. So roughly half. In 2018, Grand Coulee Dam produced 21,043 megawatts total all year. And Palo Verde produced 31,097 megawatts. So when you look at this is why capacity factor is so important. So Grand Coulee Canal, even though it's almost twice the size, produced less total electricity than Palo Verde nuclear power plant. So that's kind of interesting fact, I think. So when you're thinking about power generation, you need to think about not only the size of the plant, but you got to think about reliability too, because we want our power grid to be powered all the time. And that's why they're having so many problems in California. They have more demand than they have supply, and they're shutting down nuclear power plants in California. So those planned rolling brownouts are, in my opinion, uh, a product of the regulations that they put on their power generating facilities. Do I think that we need to build new coal plants? No, but I think we need to build something that produces large amounts of power, and I don't think wind and solar can meet that target.
Thank you. That's awesome. It's really interesting. I had that reliability perspective there, that the one can produce at a higher rate, but it's less reliable. It's really good to understand. Last question before I let you go here. Thinking about physics as a whole, since this is for my physics classes, can you think of any way that your career or your general life has been benefited or just improved by knowledge of physics or stuff that you learned relating to physics?
Yeah, so I'm going to turn this around on you, and I'm going to ask you a question. And I think it's a physics question, so hopefully you get it. All right, so I'm going to describe a little bit of what happens in a nuclear reactor first. So neutron population in a reactor is proportional to power. So the more neutrons you have, the more power you're producing, or the more power is available inside the core. Neutrons are typically born from fission as fast neutrons. We call them fast neutrons. And fast neutrons are not easily absorbed by the fuel, so we have to slow them down first. And what we use to slow those down is water. And the reason we use water is because it's easy to get, and it's not expensive. It acts as a coolant medium, but also has another purpose. So a neutron has about the same weight as a hydrogen atom, and there's lots of hydrogen atoms inside of water. So what happens is a neutron will collide with a hydrogen atom in the water, and it slows down. That collision is one of the laws of motion, I believe. Is that true, Jeff?
Which aspect of it? So like the collision.
The neutron colliding with the hydrogen and transferring some of its kinetic energy.
So we saying like
then slows down,
wanting to stay in motion, and then something else is acting upon it. Is that the law of motion you're talking about, or?
Yeah, that's what I believe you're talking about. So that's physics, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going be some complex physics in there, definitely. And
so we count on that hydrogen atom, or those hydrogen atoms, to be in water to slow down our neutrons so that we can use them to make more neutrons. So that's how that reaction works in there. So I was pretty sure that was a law of motion, and physics played a part. So
going super physical and that's super right into you. You and your wife recently bought a gym, right?
We did.
Like every piece of gym equipment is going to be involving simple machines and involving different aspects of just general physics too. So I'm sure whether you have to fix a piece of equipment or install it or move it or make sure that it's supported appropriately, weight distribution, center of mass stuff. I know that you're using it all over the place with stuff relating to the gym. We don't have, our gym here, we could do a physics lab in the gym of stuff there, but I don't think the cleanliness aspect of it right now, I don't think I'll be able to take this year's group into the gym, at least for something like that. But yeah, I had not thought of that one with the neutrons and the hydrogen atoms underground. That's a good application. Thank you. We really appreciate your time. And I know you have your girls to help with their online schooling stuff soon, so I don't want to keep you too long. Any parting words before I hit end recording?
Nope. Thanks for your time, and hope you guys learned something.
Thank you. I'll hit end recording right